So the BAFTA nominations came out this morning, and they were actually pretty interesting. They weren't, too crazy and out of the way, but there was still enough information to unravel to the point where it actually does have something of an impact on what we're going to be seeing at the Oscar nominations. What was interesting for me this year in terms of these nominations was it managed to cement certain people in their positions, in their categories, but it still managed to beg a lot of questions that at this point we're not going to have really any answers to until we get to January 23rd when the Oscar nominations are released. This is our last real round of nominations. We have the SAG Awards a couple of days before the Oscar nominations, but that's really not going to tell too much in terms of what's going to be nominated. The other thing I've noticed with the BAFTAs is in past years, especially last year, it sort of helped in terms of predicting wins for the Oscars. When Denzel Washington wasn't nominated for the BAFTA, that was sort of the shot in the foot that kind of put him in the grave for the Oscar. What was interesting was that he did win the SAG, and usually leading actors who win the SAG win the Oscars, and that streak was broken. That's how kind of impactful I think the BAFTA was when he wasn't nominated for it. That's what sort of personally leaned me towards Casey Affleck to take the Oscar. This year, though, that didn't really happen. All of the frontrunners in the categories are all nominated in their respective categories, so that wasn't really anything to look too into, but I want to touch on a lot of these categories and points and films that were nominated and certain things that happened that will, I believe, have some kind of impact or beg some kind of question as to what we're going to be seeing in a couple weeks when the Oscar nominations actually do come out. The first thing I want to talk about is Call Me By Your Name, which received a lot more love than I think people had anticipated. Call Me By Your Name has sort of not been doing amazing at some of these award shows in terms of nominations or even wins. It was given the cold shoulder at the Golden Globes, and it only picked up like one SAG. But this one, it really actually showed up quite well. Not only was it in Best Film, but it was in Best Director and Best Leading Actor. A lot of people have ruled it out of Best Director, myself included. The one category it was not in, which was interesting, was Supporting Actor, but I'll get to that when I touch on that category, really. But I think that, if anything, shows that Call Me By Your Name is not out of the running yet. This is sort of, it's saying, hey, we're still here, and we're still picking up accolades. The fact that it showed up in the amount of places it did and in the strength that it did, like I think the Best Director nomination is actually pretty big for this movie. It does show that despite what I had said about the release schedule being wonky and that resulting in the Oscars being off with it, maybe that's not entirely true. Now, that is to say, again, the British release may have been different, the voters may have seen it in a different fashion. I still stand by my prediction that Luca Guadagnino won't be nominated for director. Director was kind of odd. I'll sort of touch on that in the next point. But I do think this gave Call Me By Your Name a breath of fresh air. I think it's got another fighting chance at some wins. People have been talking to me and said in comments and on the Golden Globes live stream I did how they still think Timothée Chalamet is going to win. That's just not going to happen. This is Gary Oldman's year. I'm very confident in that, unless Gary Oldman just starts getting his ass beat. But beating him at the Golden Globe, I think, was a big sign that at these big award shows, Gary Oldman is still maintaining that position of authority and holding that front-runner position. So personally, I think it's a long shot for Timothée Chalamet, but I do think the movie is sort of crawling out of the ground and reminding us that it is still here. I can't really not talk about Blade Runner, just because of how much it did show up, which was kind of crazy. If the movie had been anywhere else at any of these other award shows, I would say this is a good sign for the movie. I don't know. I still don't really see this movie showing up in many places. I think it's, wow. I think it's great that the BAFTAs are awarding this movie and they're giving it some credit and some well-earned nominations, but it's just not the kind of movie that the Oscars are going to put up, especially in this year when there are so many movies going for director and so many going for picture. The competition is so strong and tight, and there have already been a lot of frontrunners that people are kind of predicting. I find it difficult to believe that Blade Runner has wiggle room to shoe in there. It's a sequel to a film made in 1982. If anything, it's going to pick up some technical awards at the Oscars for sure. It'll definitely be nominated for cinematography, probably visual effects, sound design, stuff like that. People have predicted a Best Picture. I think it's flown too far under the radar. I don't think it's campaigned enough. I think it's sort of been lost and forgotten. By this point, the Academy is already voting, and I don't necessarily think that Blade Runner showing up here really is going to have an impact on their decisions because they're so far into the process already. Whereas Call Me By Your Name I don't think is affecting their voting. I think it's just more so telling us, you know, this movie's still around. We may have forgotten about it. We may have not given it the time of day, but this is just sort of a nudge and a reminder that it is still around. I don't necessarily think that's the case with Blade Runner. I do think it'll be picking some technical accolades up, but nothing really too large, in my opinion. Just to touch on the category, screenplay-wise was pretty basic. Adapted screenplay was wonky, but it was because they were trying to shoe in British films in there, and they had the chance to do that because adapted screenplay is so loose this time around that they're able to just kind of throw movies in there. Molly's Game was in there, which I think is a good sign for it. Mudbound was not. My Oscar prediction that Mudbound would be nowhere because it was a Netflix film seems to be picking up a little bit. It was absolutely nowhere at the BAFTAs, and I feel like the voters may have a similar mindset to the Academy. I don't know. We'll have to see on that. I don't want to touch too much on that, but I do want to point out that Mudbound was shut out of this ceremony. But original screenplay was relatively basic, other than I, Tonya getting in there, which cut out The Post, which was also shut out. I'll talk about that more when I get into the acting categories. But I, Tonya getting a screenplay nomination is actually kind of interesting. Whether that has to do with the fact that The Post was nominated for nothing, which is actually kind of shocking to me, or whether it is just that the I, Tonya screenplay is good enough to warrant a nomination, maybe even at the Oscars. I still think the best screenplay. I still have faith in The Post, is what I'm kind of trying to say. The reviews that called it the most important film of the year still have me garnering attention to it, and I'll kind of use that into my segue to leading actress, which is very by the books, other than Annette Bening replacing Meryl Streep. Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool sort of, to me, felt like this year's I, Daniel Blake, where it's at the BAFTAs and then not at the Oscar. Like, the BAFTAs you almost have to decode to figure out what's them just nominating British shit and what's them actually just nominating the best of the best. Now, I haven't seen Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool or The Post yet, so I can't really speak to who's better or not. I'm still relatively confident Meryl Streep will be nominated, simply because she is Meryl Streep, and people are calling this one of her best performances since The Iron Lady. I think she is still kind of, for me, in there. But if there's any time now for anyone to sneak in there, like Jessica Chastain or Judi Dench, that time is now. If that's going to happen, this is sort of allowed for that. But I'm still sticking to my 5. The other 4, I think, are now completely locked in. You've got Frances McDormand, Sally Hawkins, Margot Robbie, and Saoirse Ronan. And I'm sticking by Meryl Streep being in there. But if someone else could sneak in and surprise, it's this kind of was almost a precursor, like a warning of just know that this is going to happen. With leading actor, Tom Hanks was also closed out. Tom Hanks, I may have had too much faith in when making my predictions to say that he was pretty much well in there. If The Post starts picking up steam again, it's about to wide release this week. If people really start bringing it to attention again, then maybe you've got something to look at with Tom Hanks. But he has gotten screwed over several times in the last couple of years. He's always been in like 6th or 7th place to be nominated, except for Captain Phillips, where he should have been nominated but wasn't. But you've got like Saving Mr. Banks and Bridge of Spies. This could be a time in which he gets chewed out again, and he was replaced by... who the fuck was it? It was weird. It was like someone weird that got nominated as opposed to him. But what was interesting, I'll say, was A, James Franco not being in here, which I have predicted, and B, Daniel Kaluuya being in. Now, people, I think, are saying Daniel Kaluuya could be in this category because he's a British actor, but what I find to be interesting about that is, yes, he's a British actor, but he is A, not in a British film, and B, not putting on a performance as a British character. He is nominated for the Rising Star Award, so it's clear that they really fancied his performance in the film, so maybe that's just a BAFTA thing, something they really like, but I think that does help his chances a lot, especially with James Franco being left out of the category. I think this is a big opportunity for Daniel Kaluuya to sneak in there. Now, if Tom Hanks is kicked out, chances are you're going to see James Franco and Daniel Kaluuya both in there. But maybe if Tom Hanks is in there, you're still looking at a Kaluuya or Franco, and this could be a big move to sneak Kaluuya in there. Or it is simply a British thing. Again, it's hard to decode what they're doing that's an actual precursor for the Oscars, or what is simply just... Jamie Bell! Now it hit me. That's who was replaced with Tom Hanks, or James Franco, whatever. But it's hard to tell what's really going on behind the scenes with the BAFTAs, but I think this is a good thing for Daniel Kaluuya, and I think these are his best chances of being nominated for the Oscar, and I'm standing by my prediction that we'll be seeing him in the category, not James Franco, unless Tom Hanks is kicked out, in which case you're going to see both of them in that category. That's kind of just the way things are going to fall. The two supporting categories are where some really interesting things happened. I'll talk with supporting actress first. What this did, in my opinion, was obviously, Laurie Metcalf and Allison Janney have been cemented for a while. Octavia Spencer now, I think, is not a sure bet, but a pretty good bet. I'm almost sure she was nominated for the SAG. I'm gonna check really quick, actually. Shit, no, she wasn't. Okay, but she has been, and the SAG Awards supporting nominations, we all know, were kind of wonky with, like, Steve Carell for Battle of the Sexes and shit, so I don't know how I feel about their nominations this year. But Octavia Spencer has still remained a name, a pretty big deal within these award ceremonies, and The Shape of Water was pretty highly recognized at the BAFTAs this year, and I feel pretty confident, or more, at least more confident now about Octavia Spencer making it into the running, seeing as she showed up at this specific award ceremony. Now, the two that were kicked out, or you can look at three, you've got Holly Hunter, Mary J. Blige, and Hong Chau. Wow. And the two that made it in were Leslie Manville for Phantom Thread and Kristen Scott Thomas for Darkest Hour. Now, while a lot of people, including myself, at first glance were like, well, those are two British performers in two relatively British-based films, so that's why, I don't necessarily think that's entirely true. I think both of them have, at a time, been contenders to be nominated for an Oscar. Leslie Manville, a little more than Kristen Scott Thomas. I remember her name coming up a lot when Phantom Thread first released and how impressed people were with her performance. The issue with both of them getting into the supporting category, and the reason I left both of them off of my prediction list, is because both of those films are so centric around their leading actor. Darkest Hour is Gary Oldman's show, and what I've heard about Phantom Thread, it seems to be Daniel Day-Lewis's show. If anything, when I saw Darkest Hour, Kristen Scott Thomas really actually surprised me in how good her performance was, and it is a kind of performance the Academy likes. It's a performance that when she comes in, she steals the scene, she steals the show, and your attention goes right to her, even though she's not on screen for an incredibly long allocated amount of time. I can't speak as much to Phantom Thread because it hasn't released here yet. It comes out like next week or in 2 weeks, and as soon as I see it, I'll be talking about that more. But I don't necessarily think this is just something that the British Academy did. I think both of them, while they might be left field, there's always something that crazy that happens at the Oscar nominations, and if anything could happen, maybe it's one of these two sneaking in, and then you've got the question of, well, is Holly Hunter, Mary J. Blige, Hong Chau put in there with whoever else was just introduced? That does not allow anymore for the two. People have been saying Holly Hunter's time is running up, but she still did get that SAG nomination, so that kind of teeters it over. Mudbound being left out completely from this. Ask the question, is Mudbound going to be left out completely from the Oscars too? Hong Chau, this is the first time she hasn't showed up, so there's a lot of interesting questions to think about with supporting actress. What I take away from this is that the three are pretty strong to be predicted. I'm pretty comfortable with the three of those, but I think the question of who are the other two is now even broader than it was before. And then with supporting actor, it actually did something quite similar for me, where I think there are three people who are pretty set. You've got Sam Rockwell, who just is hot off a Golden Globe win, and I think his chances of winning are just increasing as the days go. Willem Dafoe, who is obviously, I think, always been a lock. He's been everywhere ever since the movie came out, and he's got, like, career-high performances. I mean, he's been in. And Christopher Plummer, who showed up again here after putting on a pretty great performance in All the Money in the World. Now that he's got that attention, I think he's sort of spiraling more. People are paying more attention to that film, and I think he's sort of managed to get himself a spot in this category. And then the other two. I've changed my winner prediction, actually. I think now the winner of Best Supporting Actor is going to be Hugh Grant for Paddington 2. There's a point where you're trying too hard to nominate British films. I'm sure Hugh Grant is charming in Paddington 2. But, like, really? I mean, he better be real good. He's not going to be nominated for the Oscar. I'm just about as sure as anything on that. So, we already have who's that fourth spot. And the other one went to Woody Harrelson. And this is his second time being nominated after the SAG. And I had originally chalked that up as, okay, that's just something the SAG Awards did. But maybe this is actually something that we should be paying attention to. If 3 Billboards or at least continues to gain the steam that it's been gaining after just sweeping the Golden Globes, which I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I predicted very well. maybe it's going to start picking up more and more. Maybe we're looking at a Best Picture frontrunner, maybe not frontrunner, but real contender. And if that starts to become the case, maybe Woody Harrelson is actually a possibility for a double nomination. With that being said, someone has to fill that Hugh Grant slot. My pick is still with Armie Hammer for Call Me By Your Name. I think that's a very Academy-based performance. The movie doesn't really work without Armie Hammer. He's the bread and butter, just alongside Timothée Chalamet. And I think he's still going to be in there. Despite the fact that he hasn't shown up consistently or that well, I'm still pretty sure he's going to be in there. So the question is, for me, can Woody Harrelson kick out someone like Richard Jenkins or possibly Armie Hammer if the Academy follows suit with the BAFTAs? Maybe. If we're getting that far, I think now that it's happened twice, Woody Harrelson could be a real possibility to sneak into this category. But again, things are so up in the air now that we have a couple lock-ins. There's just that question of who could fill these slots, I believe, is even broader now. And these questions aren't going to be allowed to be answered for a couple more weeks. Because odds are, when we get the SAG Awards, Laurie Metcalf or Allison Janney is going to win Supporting Actress, and Willem Dafoe or Sam Rockwell is going to win the SAG, so that doesn't really help us determine who's going to be nominated. So I think at this point, it's just a waiting game, but it's certainly going to make the day the Oscar nominations come out that much more interesting, especially in these two categories. And that's mainly all I have to talk about. Those are the big points. That's how I think this may impact the Oscars. What I'm mainly saying is, I think it's helped to cement a couple of people, but it's also broadened the question that much further. And I think that's why this is one of the most interesting years we've seen in a while. This is a super interesting year for the Oscars. I can't wait for the nominations to come out. I'm very excited to see what's going to happen there. And yeah, those are my thoughts on this. In terms of upcoming videos, Call Me By Your Name review will be very soon. The second I get time for that, I wanted to do this video today just because the BAFTA nominations just came out. So as soon as I get time to do my Call Me By Your Name review, I'm going to shoot it and post it. I don't know if I'm going to do anything with the Critics' Choice Awards because God knows they don't really matter. If you tuned into the Golden Globes live stream a few days ago, first of all, thank you very much for tuning into that. Second of all, we're going to be doing something similar. Me and the same guy who did that, Max, are going to be doing a SAG Award reaction live stream on the 21st, which is in like 2 weeks, I believe. And then I have, the day the Oscar nominations come out, I have finals, which means I get home earlier. I get home around 11:30 a.m., so I'll be able to, I'm going to turn my phone and everything off, and I'm going to pull up the Oscar nomination video and do a reaction to that, which I've been talking about doing for a couple years, but haven't been able to do. I'll finally be able to do that this year. Lots more content coming your way, lots more stuff I want to do. I saw a comment in a recent video asking what my picks for Oscars would be, like if I could pick the 5, who I'd pick. I think that's an interesting thing to do, and I'm considering doing a video on that. I'll have to see like how similar my picks would be to the Academy's picks. But that's sort of what to look forward to in the coming weeks. Thank you guys so much for the support. The channel keeps on growing and growing, and it's been amazing. Thank you guys so much if you've been watching consistently, and if you're new, thank you so much for checking out the channel. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you all next time.